In the 9th century, in the city of Baghdad, an enormous and deliberate act of rescue is underway, and almost no one alive today knows the names of the people carrying it out. They are translators, scholars fluent in Greek and Syriac and Persian and Sanskrit and Arabic, working in the great cosmopolitan capital of a young and confident empire, and they are engaged in one of the most important salvage operations in the history of the human mind. All around the Mediterranean, the accumulated learning of the ancient world, the mathematics of the Greeks, the astronomy, the medicine, the philosophy, the patient discoveries of 1,000 years, is scattered and decaying, much of it half forgotten in a Europe that has lost the ability even to read the language it was written in. And in Baghdad, under the patronage of caliphs who prize this knowledge as treasure, these translators are gathering it up before it vanishes. They hunt down aging manuscripts, sometimes at tremendous cost, sometimes as prizes demanded in the terms of a peace treaty. They render Aristotle and Euclid and the Greek physicians into Arabic. They bring in the number system of India, zero and all. And they do not merely copy what they find, they argue with it, correct it, extend it, and push past it into territory the ancients never reached. Sit for a moment with what these unnamed scholars accomplished, because if the chain had broken here, if this rescue had not happened, much of the wisdom of the ancient world would simply have been lost. And the whole later story of this book might never have taken place. We owe the survival of a huge portion of Greek thought to the fact that when Europe let it slip, the Islamic world caught it, preserved it, enriched it, and eventually handed it back. But this chapter is about something even bigger than that rescue. It is about a change in the very nature of how human beings hold on to what they know, a change that would make such rescues, one day, unnecessary. Because up to this point in our story, knowledge had always been terrifyingly fragile, for a single reason. And in these 7 centuries, human beings finally, at long last, began to fix it. Here is the fragility, and you should feel it in your bones, because we have watched it stalk this book from the very beginning. For all of human history until now, knowledge had traveled chiefly as a lineage, passed down from master to disciple, teacher to student, one remarkable mind kindling the next, like a flame handed from candle to candle. The great mathematician trains the students who will carry the mathematics forward. The master physician teaches the apprentices who will keep the healing alive. Confucius gathers his circle, Socrates gathers his, Plato founds his academy, and Aristotle his lyceum, each a school built around a towering individual. And this works, brilliantly, for a time. But look at the terrible weakness built into it. A lineage is only ever as strong as its next generation. Break the chain, let the students scatter, let a war or a plague or a persecution sever the line of transmission, for even a single generation and the knowledge is simply gone. It dies with the last person who held it, exactly as an illiterate elder's whole store of wisdom died with them back in chapter 1, before writing. Writing had helped enormously. A book can wait on a shelf for a reader. But a book without anyone trained to understand it is nearly as mute as no book at all. As Europe discovered when it found itself holding Greek manuscripts, it could no longer read. Knowledge that depends on a fragile chain of living minds is knowledge perpetually one bad generation away from oblivion. And this is the great achievement of these 7 centuries, the thing that makes them a genuine turning point in the history of ideas, even though no single dazzling discovery defines them. Human beings invented something sturdier than the lineage. They built institutions, structures that could manufacture and preserve knowledge, regardless of whether any particular genius happened to be born. They made learning into a machine that outlived its individual members, a thing that kept running, even as the specific people inside it lived and died, and were replaced so that the knowledge no longer rested on the luck of the right student finding the right teacher, but was carried forward by the structure itself. Learning stopped being a flame passed hand to hand, forever in danger of going out, and became something closer to a hearth built into the walls of the house, tended by whoever lived there, burning on across the generations. And the story of how this happened has 2 centers of gravity, not one, because for most of this long period, the brighter of the 2 was not in Europe at all. Return to that young empire and its confident capital. In the centuries after the rise of Islam, the early caliphates had assembled an astonishing realm, a single civilization stretching from Spain in the west, across North Africa and the Middle East, all the way to the borders of India and Central Asia in the east. And this vast domain happened to sit squarely on top of the intellectual inheritance of half the ancient world. It contained the lands of the Greeks and the Persians. It traded with India. It had inherited the libraries and the learning of civilizations going back thousands of years. What the Islamic world did with this inheritance was momentous, and it unfolded in 3 stages, each more important than the last. First, they gathered and translated. On a scale never before attempted, scholars organized the systematic translation of the scientific and philosophical texts of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians into Arabic, collecting the scattered wisdom of the ancient world and rendering it into a single common language of learning. This was the great rescue we began with, and it was enormous. The mathematics and astronomy and medicine and philosophy of antiquity, saved from decay and gathered together in centers of study, where scholars from across the empire could read them. Second, and this is the part that matters most, the part that separates true intellectual civilization from mere librarianship, they did not merely preserve. They pressed past. They read the ancient masters, absorbed everything the Greeks and Indians and Persians had figured out, and then went further, adding discoveries of their own that permanently reshaped whole fields of human knowledge. This was not a photocopying operation. It was a living, advancing intellectual culture, and it produced minds of the very first rank. Consider 3 of them, each of whom left a mark still visible today. There was Al-Khwarizmi, a Persian mathematician working in the 9th century, who wrote a treatise on how to solve equations through the systematic operations of balancing and restoration, moving quantities from one side of an equation to the other, combining like terms, following orderly procedures to hunt down an unknown value. From the Arabic word in the title of that book, Algebra, the restoration comes a word you learned in school and may have dreaded. Algebra. And from a Latinized version of Al-Khwarizmi's own name, comes another word that now runs the entire digital world, algorithm. This one man's name and book are embedded, right now, in the language of every computer program running on Earth. But algebra matters here for a reason deeper than its usefulness, and it connects directly to the deepest thread running through this whole book. It was a further great leap in abstraction. Ordinary arithmetic deals with particular numbers, this many sheep, that many coins. Algebra reasons about unknown quantities as such. It manipulates the general, rather than the particular, letting a single method solve an entire class of problems all at once. Instead of laboriously working out one specific puzzle, you capture the underlying pattern that governs every puzzle of that type, and solve them all in one stroke. It is the same movement of mind we have been tracing since the first symbol on the cave wall, the mind climbing to ever higher levels of abstraction, letting one thing stand for many, reaching a powerful new altitude. The unknown itself now has a symbol, and can be reasoned about, and made to give up its secrets. Then there was Ibn al-Haytham, working in Egypt, who did something that reads as astonishingly, almost eerily modern, and who deserves to be far more famous than he is, because he may have been doing real science, in the full sense we mean today, centuries before anyone in Europe. He studied light and vision, and rather than simply reasoning about them in his head, or deferring to what the great Greeks had said, he tested. He insisted that claims be checked against careful, controlled observation. He devised deliberate experiments, set up specifically to decide between competing explanations, to force nature to reveal which idea was right and which was wrong. And using this method, he overturned one of the most respected authorities in all of ancient science. The Greeks had largely believed that we see because the eye sends out rays that reach out and touch the world, like invisible feelers. Ibn al-Haytham demonstrated, through experiment, that this was backwards, that we see by light entering the eye from outside, bouncing off objects and streaming in through the pupil. He was right, and the revered ancients were wrong, and he proved it not by arguing more cleverly, but by testing. And in that insistence, that a theory, no matter how venerable its author, must ultimately answer to experiment, many historians see one of the earliest and clearest articulations of the scientific method itself. Hold on tightly to that idea, because it is the seed of the single most powerful tool of thought our species will ever invent. And we will watch it burst into full, world-shattering flower just 2 chapters from now. The notion that authority must bow to evidence, that you settle a dispute about the world not by asking who said it, but by going and checking, that idea is quietly being born here, in an experiment about how the eye sees. And there were the great philosophers and physicians, thinkers of such stature that Europe would study them for centuries. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, produced a vast synthesis of medical knowledge, so comprehensive and so well organized that it remained a standard text in European medical schools for hundreds of years. Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes, became the supreme commentator on Aristotle, so deeply associated with interpreting the great Greek philosopher that later European scholars would refer to him simply as the commentator. And these thinkers wrestled with a problem that would come to define this entire age. On both sides of the Mediterranean, a problem that goes to the very heart of the axial inheritance we have been tracing. They had inherited, on one hand, the towering rational system of Greek philosophy, the demand that things be demonstrated, proven by logic, answerable to reason. And they held, on the other hand, the truths of revealed religion, truths received through faith and sacred scripture. And where the two seemed to conflict, where reason appeared to point one way and revelation another, what was one to do? Which had the final authority, the proof or the prophet, the examined argument or the received word of God? This was one of the deepest questions a thinking person of this age could face, and some of the finest minds in the Islamic world spent their lives on it. Third and finally, the Islamic world did one more thing of incalculable importance. It became the bridge. It was the channel through which this whole enriched inheritance, the recovered Greek learning, the Indian number system with its precious zero, the new discoveries in algebra and optics and medicine, the great commentaries on Aristotle would eventually flow into Europe and help ignite everything that followed. The lamp of learning had been lit and tended in the East. Its light was about to travel west. Because in Europe, meanwhile, something was stirring, a hunger. Western Europe, in the earlier part of this period, was a relative intellectual backwater compared to the brilliant civilization of the Islamic world or the sophistication of the Byzantine East. Much of the ancient learning had been lost there. The Greek language itself had largely been forgotten in the Latin West. But European scholars knew, achingly, that a great inheritance had slipped through their fingers, that there had once been Aristotle and Euclid, and a whole world of ancient wisdom now beyond their reach. And so, from around the 11th and 12th centuries onward, they went looking to get it back. Latin scholars, hungry for the learning they had lost, set about translating the Greek philosophers and scientists into Latin. And here is the crucial thing. They very often did so by working from the Arabic versions, translating the Greek thinkers and their Islamic commentators back into Latin, frequently from the very manuscripts the Islamic world had preserved and enriched. The rescued knowledge was coming home, but it came home transformed, carrying with it centuries of Islamic scholarship layered on top of the ancient Greek foundation. And it carried that same great problem with it, the tension between reason and revelation, which now took root in European soil and became the defining intellectual struggle of the medieval West. And it was in Europe, in these centuries, that the age's most distinctive and most enduring institution took shape, an institution so extraordinarily successful that it is still with us, still recognizable, still doing its job in our own time. In cities like Bologna and Paris and Oxford, around the 11th and 12th centuries, scholars and students began to organize themselves into something genuinely new under the sun. Self-governing corporate bodies, with their own official charters, their own courses of study, their own power to grant degrees and regulate their own affairs. They called these bodies universities, and they were something the world had never quite seen before. Now, here is why the university was such a revolutionary idea, and why it belongs at the very heart of this chapter. Think about the old model, the model that had prevailed for all of human history. The school gathered around a single teacher. The academy was Plato's. When the master's line of successors faltered, the institution faded. Such a school is its great teacher, and it lives and dies with the lineage. But a university is fundamentally different. It does not depend on any one mind. It is a durable machine for the accumulation and transmission of knowledge, built to keep running by its very structure rather than by luck. The particular brilliant professor grows old and dies, but the chair he held does not vanish. It is simply filled again by his successor. The curriculum endures. The degrees keep being conferred, year after year, generation after generation. The institution absorbs new members and releases trained graduates in a continuous stream. And it goes on doing this for centuries, indifferent to the mortality of any individual within it. This was the solution to the ancient fragility, the answer to the terror that has haunted this book since chapter 1, that knowledge dies with the knower. Knowledge had finally acquired an institutional body, a home that would not perish when its inhabitants did. Some of these very universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, are still operating today, nearly 1,000 years later, still teaching, still granting degrees, still running long after every single person who founded them turned to dust. That is the machine these centuries built. It is, in a real sense, the direct ancestor of every university on Earth, and it may be the most successful knowledge institution our species has ever devised. Inside this new institutional body, the great intellectual project of the medieval age had a name: scholasticism. and it has been treated unfairly by history, so let us give it the fair hearing it deserves. You have probably heard the mockery. The caricature of medieval philosophers, as absurd hair-splitters solemnly debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, the very image of useless, arid, disconnected from reality thinking. Set that caricature aside, because it badly obscures what was really a serious, rigorous, and profoundly consequential enterprise. An enterprise that, whatever you think of its conclusions, forged the very intellectual habits that all later science and philosophy would be built upon. The scholastics faced a genuine and difficult tension, the same one the Islamic thinkers had wrestled with, now at the center of European thought. They had inherited two great sources of truth that did not always agree. On one side stood the magnificent rational system of Aristotle and the whole Greek tradition of logical demonstration, reason, proof, the power of the human mind to work things out for itself. On the other side stood the revealed truths of Christian faith, received through scripture and church teaching. And where these two seemed to conflict, the scholastics could not simply ignore the problem. Something had to be done. Their response was to develop a rigorous and disciplined method of disputation, and it is a genuinely beautiful piece of intellectual machinery. You begin by stating a question. Then, and this is the crucial, admirable part, you marshal the strongest arguments and authorities on each side, including the side you intend to reject. You lay out the best possible case against your own position, in its full force, fairly and honestly, before you answer it. And only then do you work systematically toward a reasoned resolution, one that tries to do justice to both reason and revelation, distinguishing different senses of words, following each argument carefully to its logical conclusion. The supreme monument of this whole effort was the work of Thomas Aquinas, a medieval thinker of staggering intellectual power and patience, who set himself the enormous task of showing, at vast length and with extraordinary subtlety, that faith and reason are not enemies but allies. That reason, rightly used, leads toward the truths of faith rather than away from them. Whatever you make of his theology, and people have argued about it for the better part of 800 years, the method he practiced was a formidable training ground for the human mind. Look at what those intellectual habits actually are. Laying out the strongest version of the view you oppose before you refute it. Carefully distinguishing between different meanings of a term, so that arguments don't talk past each other. Following a line of reasoning honestly all the way to its logical end, wherever it leads. Marshalling evidence and authority in an orderly way. Building a rigorous, step-by-step case that anticipates and answers every objection. These are the intellectual habits of careful thought itself. They are precisely the disciplines on which the coming scientific and philosophical revolutions would be built. The scientist who lays out and tests the competing hypothesis before accepting her own. The philosopher who steelmans his opponent's argument before answering it. The honest thinker who follows the evidence to an unwelcome conclusion, rather than stopping where it gets comfortable. All of them are practicing habits of mind that were sharpened and systematized in the medieval schools. The scholastics are often painted as the very enemies of the scientific spirit, the dusty dogmatists that the coming revolutions would have to sweep away. But that is a slander. In a deep and real sense, they built the mental toolkit that made those revolutions possible. You cannot overthrow authority with evidence, as the next centuries would learn to do, unless someone has first taught you how to construct a rigorous argument, weigh competing claims, and follow reason honestly to its end. The medieval schools taught exactly that. So step back now and survey what these 7 centuries had assembled, because by the 14th century, something remarkable had quietly come together, even though the great explosion it would produce still lay ahead. Picture it all laid out. There now existed, for the first time, permanent institutions dedicated to learning universities that would preserve and transmit knowledge across the generations by their very structure, immune to the death of any individual mind. There existed a disciplined method of rigorous argument, forged in the scholastic schools, the mental habits of careful, honest, systematic reasoning. There existed a recovered library of ancient science and philosophy, rescued from oblivion and vastly enriched by centuries of brilliant Islamic contribution, now flowing into a hungry, reawakening Europe. And there existed powerful new tools waiting to be picked up and used. The abstraction of algebra, which let the mind reason about the general, rather than the particular, and, most explosive of all, that early articulation of the experimental method, the radical idea, glimpsed by Ibn al-Haytham, that a claim about the world must answer to observation and test, rather than to the authority of ancient names. The machinery for a knowledge explosion was, in other words, very nearly complete. All the parts were on the table. And yet the explosion itself had not yet come. Something was still missing, two things in fact, and it is worth naming them precisely, because they are exactly what the next chapters are about. The first missing piece was a way to take inherited authority, the revered wisdom of the ancients, the accumulated word of the great names everyone deferred to, and check it against the evidence, and watch it fail. The scholastics had learned to reason with tremendous rigor, but they still reasoned largely within the authority of Aristotle and Scripture, seeking to reconcile and interpret the great inherited truths, rather than to overthrow them. What no one had yet done on a grand scale was to turn to one of the towering authorities of the age, put its claims to a direct test against what could actually be observed in the world, find those claims wrong and say so out loud. The tool for doing this, Ibn al-Haytham's experiment, the appeal from authority to evidence, was sitting right there waiting, but it had not yet been turned in full force against the biggest authorities of all. The second missing piece was a way to make ideas so cheap and so uncontrollable that no institution on earth, no church, no king, no university, could contain them or call them back. For all that had been achieved, knowledge was still expensive and scarce. Every single book in every library still had to be copied out by hand, letter by letter, by a human being bent over a desk for months, which meant books were rare and costly treasures, and the ideas inside them spread only as fast as a hand could copy and only as far as the powerful permitted. Control the small number of precious copies, and you could still, in principle, control the ideas. Both of these missing pieces, the tool to break authority against evidence, and the tool to make ideas too cheap and too wild to be controlled, were about to arrive. And they would arrive within just a few decades of one another, at the dawn of a new age. One of them was a machine, made of wood and metal and squeezed ink, that would flood the world with words and shatter forever the power of any authority to control what people could read and think. The other was a new spirit of looking at old texts and at the heavens themselves, that would take the most revered authorities in all of Western civilization and, one by one, begin to prove them wrong. Together, they would end the medieval world and begin the modern one. That is where we turn next.